Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 39 of Weekend Warriors, the review series for Gran Turismo's sports cars, sports coupes, two-seater ragtops, luxury coupes, modern muscle cars, that kind of thing. It's a very inclusive category, the cars within it vary quite wildly, and some can be totally different and are totally different to each other. Now this particular car is much more of a traditional sports car. When you think sports car, most people would probably say two doors, two seats, probably a ragtop. That is this car, the Toyota MR2, mid-engine, rear drive, two seats. Now this particular version of the MR2 is the newest version, or the newest overall shape. Not in newest form though, for a very specific reason, because there is a newer version of this MR2 on the game. It's a couple of years newer, and that newer version, at least for me personally, isn't quite as good looking. It's a little softer, the front end looks a little more squashed, and interestingly, it's not as good. The on-paper numbers are inferior to this model, the 1999 MR2. The power is lower on the newer model, the weight is higher, as is the price. So if you're looking to buy a newer MR2, I would definitely recommend the 99 shape instead of the facelifted version of this MR2. Now the MR2 has been a part of Gran Turismo for quite a while, in multiple forms: the boxier, older shape with the pop-up headlights, then what I like to call the mini Ferrari, the kind of F355 shape, and for sheer performance that model is the most dominant, and then this version which, in a similar way to the Celica, became a little bit softer in later years. And although in real life that isn't necessarily a bad thing, it does neuter some of its performance. The older model, the GT6 for instance, is a much faster car. In a straight line in particular, it's a much more rabid vehicle, it looks more purposeful, whereas these later ones, they have a little bit more of the Mazda MX-5 way of thinking. Low power, low price, low weight, more affordable in general, not just to buy but to run. Understandably so, it makes them more attainable, but for the sheer performance edge, they're just not as good. It's a simple fact. What about on the game though? How does this MR2 compare to the slightly older MR2 and also the much older 80s style MR2? But also how does it compare to other sports cars, of course, in general? Well, consider what you get. First of all, there's the price. Japanese performance cars on Gran Turismo do generally have good prices, and this is no exception. It costs just under 20 grand. That's a pretty good start. For that, you get a 1.8 litre mid-mounted engine, rear-wheel drive, and you can turbocharge that engine up to some pretty decent power levels. 323 horsepower is not bad at all. It also puts out 237 foot-pounds of torque and only weighs 848 kilos, which, to put that into perspective, is the same weight as the Nissan 240 RS, which we covered in the last review video in a different series, and also Renault's 5 Turbo in fully tuned form. So that gives you some idea of the kind of level that you can expect from this car, at least on paper. The horsepower per tonne is pretty good, 381, and the PP is not too high, but it is quite high. For a vehicle that's small and cheap, 508 PP is quite high. But unlike many other vehicles, I would say that this is kind of justified in being that high, because it is a very quick little car. The handling is very good, the grip is very impressive, and the sheer compact size, and of course the weight as well, really allow this car to be so much more manoeuvrable than something like a big modern muscle car, or obviously a big luxury coupe, or even just a larger coupe in general. Those cars will often have the advantage in a straight line, but around corners, something like an MX-5, an Elise, an MR2 will usually have the advantage for sheer nimbleness. Plus, they're more beginner friendly because they don't need a huge amount of power to go fast. They're so small and light that the speed basically just comes naturally to them. Now in a straight line, of course, that's a totally different ballgame, and that's why vehicles like the Tomica ZZ2 and also the slightly older MR2 stand out so much because they really do have incredible top-end performance, given that the cars of that type don't usually have that good top-end performance, which is why they stand out so much. This car isn't remarkable in a straight line. It's pretty good. The acceleration's certainly good enough, but it's not going to blow your mind. Around corners, it's not necessarily the best of sports cars. It's certainly not like a top 5 vehicle, but it's more than good enough, again, to win races. When you combine the good handling, the kind nature, I would say, of the car, it is very beginner friendly, it's forgiving, it's not difficult or phasing to drive at all, it's a very low stress vehicle, and when you combine all of those characteristics with 323 horsepower, you've got yourself a pretty decent little sports car, especially for under 20 grand to buy. Now, the MR2 has never been a car that I've loved, to be honest. I don't dislike it, but I've just never really used it that much. I'm not a big fan of small sports cars in general. Even stuff like the Lotus Elise, I've never been a huge fan of. I don't hate them, I don't think they're bad cars, definitely not. I've just never been into them. If I'm going to go for a car like that, I'll tend to go more for something like the Tomicara ZZS, or a Vauxhall VX220 even. The stuff which doesn't tend to be used quite as much, the less obvious choices, if you will. But that being said, the MR2 is in a strange position on Gran Turismo where it's actually become such an obvious choice of small sports car that it kind of isn't anymore. You don't actually see a huge amount of people using MR2s, especially not of this generation. So if you fancy trying an affordable, fun, not necessarily overwhelmingly good, but certainly good enough in each area, small sports car that can win you races, then you may want to check out the MR2. But that's it for this pick overall. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.